morning. Welcome back to UITM News. I'm Nurisha Dwani.
And I'm Nafahana. Today news will be about SDG 8, decent work and economic growth.
We will have a sharing session by an associate professor, our own reporter, an economy expert, a retired teacher, and a special guest by Tan Sri Zeti Aziz. Over the past 25 years, the number of workers living in extreme poverty has declined dramatically. Despite the lasting impact of 2008 economic crisis and global recession, in developing countries, the middle class now makes up more than 34% of total employment, a number that has most tripled between 1991 and 2015. However, as the global economy continues to recover, we are seeing a slower growth, widening inequality, and not enough jobs to keep up with the growing labor force. According to the International Labour Organization, more than 204 million people were unemployed in 2015. The SDG promotes sustained economic growth, high levels of productivity and technological innovation, encouraging entrepreneurship and job creation are key to this as are effective measures to eradicate forced labor, slavery, and human trafficking. With these targets in mind, the goal is to achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men by 2030. In today's news, we are going to discover more about SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. So what is SDG 8 and what's the purpose behind SDG 8? SDG 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Sustained and inclusive economic growth can drive progress, creating more decent jobs and improve living standards. What does decent work mean? Decent work means opportunities for everyone to get work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration. The continued lack of decent work opportunities, insufficient investments, and underconsumption lead to an erosion of the basic social contract underlying democratic societies that all must share in progress. Let's look at the importance of SDG 8. SDG 8 recognizes the importance of sustained economic growth and high levels of economic productivity for the creation of well-paid jobs, well-quality jobs, as well as resource efficiency in consumption and production. It reaffirms the mutually supportive relationship between economic, social, and environmental policies, full employment, and decent work. Globally, labor productivity has increased and unemployment is back to pre-financial crisis levels. However, the global economy is growing at a slower rate and a worrying productivity gap is opening up between low-income countries and middle-income countries. Now, what happened to the global economic growth due to the COVID-19 pandemic? As we all know, the emerge of COVID-19 pandemic surely has dropped a big impact to the world. Every single person in this world, whether affected individually, socially, and most importantly, economically. The COVID-19 pandemic affected the global economies in ways such as, based on the International Labour Association, since the start of COVID-19 pandemic in the year 2019, the global working hours has dropped to 14% in the quarter of 2020. Moreover, more than 1 in 6 young people has either lost their jobs or will forcibly stop working due to circumstances such as the closure of working place or downsizing of their company. On the other hand, those who remained employed were reported to experience their working hours cut by 23%, thus decrease their monthly income too. This pandemic too has affected one of the most important global economic sources, which is the tourism. If it did not show any signs of massive recovery by the year 2021, international arrivals may be experiencing a decrease from 60 to 80%. As we can see in the figures I've shown, the global economic growth has shown a slight decline before the pandemic. But after the emerge of COVID-19, global economic growth is expected to decline even further and become one of the worst economic recessions since the Great Depression era. So let's talk about the economic growth in Malaysia. As we can see in the figures, Malaysia once hit an economic recession in the year of 1996, but slowly it rises and stay above par annually. The strong performance of Malaysia economy in recent years has been attributed to several factors, including improvement in its labor market, sufficient spending on infrastructure, a pro-cycling budget, and growing global demand for oil and gas and electronics. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic again hit Malaysia economic growth by coupled with declining government expenditure and lower public and private investment, halted its growth trend in 2020 and even caused the economy to contract. The COVID-19 pandemic doesn't only give impact globally, but also to Malaysia. The impact of COVID-19 on Malaysia's economy can be seen by the decrement of Malaysia economic growth below 10%, which reaches up until negative 5%. The high unemployment rate since 2019, the year where COVID-19 emerges, the unemployment rate in Malaysia increases from 3.2% to 5.3%. You can see the rate of unemployment in Malaysia in the figures below. I would like to pass this stage to my co-anchor, Nur Farhana, for her to explain more about the objectives of SDG 8. Take it away, Farhana.
Hi everyone, so my name is Dr. Hana and I am currently an associate professor in UIA. So in this section, I will be explaining again briefly about the objective of SDG 8 and then I will be moving on to the target and the indicator of this SDG one by one. And after that, I will be explaining about the target group. Who is this SDG is targeted to? So I think without further ado, let's move on. So in this section, we will first be looking at the objective of SDG 8. I think it was mentioned earlier, but it's okay. We're going to discuss it again. So the overall objective for SDG 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all by 2030. Let's move on to the target, which is what to be achieved, and also the indicator. In what way can we see whether the target has been reached or not? So for the first one, 8.1 is to sustain per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances, and in particular, at least 7% gross domestic product growth per annum, which is annual, in the least developed countries. And the indicator is, we can see whether the target is achieved or not by looking at the annual growth rate of real GDP per capita. So for 8.2 is to achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading, and innovation, including through a focus on high value added and labor-intensive sector. The indicator is the annual growth rate of real GDP per employed person. 8.3 is to promote development-oriented policies that support productive activities, decent job creation, entrepreneurship, creativity and innovation, and also to encourage the formalization and growth of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise, which are including through access to financial services. 8.3.1, the proportion of informal employment in non-agriculture employment by sex. So 8.4, the target is to improve progressively through 2030 global resource efficiency in consumption and production and endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation in accordance with the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production with developed countries taking the lead. So for 8.4, we have two indicators. So the first one is material footprint per capita, and material footprint per GDP. The second one is domestic material consumption per capita, and the domestic material consumption per GDP. So the fifth target and indicator is by 2030, it is for us to achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including young people and persons with disabilities, and also equal pay for work of equal value. So 8.5.1, we can look at whether this target have been achieved or not by looking at the average hourly earnings of female and male employees by occupation, age, and person with disabilities. We can also look at by the unemployment rate by sex, age, and person with disabilities. So the sixth, by 2020, substantially reduce the proportion of youth not in employment and education or training. I think this target has been stalled ever since the COVID-19 hit us, and I think we will need to adjust the time frame. So how can we see whether this target have been achieved or not is by looking at the proportion of youth aged 15 to 24 years old not in education, employment, or training. 8.7 is to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and the use of child soldier, and by the end of 2025, and all forms of child labor. So 8.7.1 is we can look at the proportion and number of children aged 5 to 17 years old engaged in child labor by sex and age. So 8.8 is we want to protect labor rights and promote safe and secure working environment for all workers, including migrant workers, and in particular women migrant workers and those in precarious employment. So again, we have two indicators here. The first one is the frequency rate of fatal and non-fatal occupational injuries by sex and migrant status. And the second one is we can see whether there is an increasement or not in the national compliance of labor rights, which is freedom of association and collective bargaining based on International Labor Organization, or known as ILO, textual resources and national legislation by sex and migrant status. 8.9 is by 2030, we need to devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promote local culture and products. 8.9.1, tourism need to direct the GDP as a proportion of total GDP and in growth rate. 8.9.2, the number of jobs in tourism industries as a proportion of total job and growth rate of jobs by sex. So 8.10 is to strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions to encourage and expand access to banking, insurance, and financial services for all. We have two indicators again. The number of commercial bank branches and automated teller machine ATM per 1,000 adults, and proportion of adults 15 years and above with an account at a bank or another financial institution with a mobile money service provider. So we have another X2 extra target indicator. So for A is to increase aid for trade support for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, through the enhanced integrated framework for trade-related technical assistance to least developed countries. So 8.8.1 is we can look at the aid for trade commitment and disbursement. So the last one is by 2020, develop and operationalize a global strategy for youth employment and implement the Global Job Pact of the ILO. 8.B.1, total government spending in social protection and employment programs as a proportion of the national budget and GDP. So I think that's all for the target and the indicator. So now let's move on to the target group. Who are this SDG is targeted to? So the first one is least developed countries. According to the US list of least developed countries, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Madagascar are examples of countries that are listed in the list. Data from the World Bank data stated that in 2019, Afghanistan records only 3.9 GDP. The second target group is all women and men, including young people and persons with disabilities. The third is people who are involved in forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. Our aim is not to encourage them to stay, but we want to get them out from such activities as soon as possible. So forced labor is all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So modern slavery and human trafficking fall under the category of forced labor. So what is modern slavery? Modern slavery is the severe exploitation of other people for personal gain or commercial gain. Modern slavery is actually all around us, but it is often just out of sight. People can be entrapped in making our clothes, serving our food, working in factories, or working in houses as cook, cleaners, or nannies. From the outside, it can look like a normal job, but in reality, people are being controlled. They can face violence or threat, or even have their passport taken away and are being threatened with deportation. So many have fallen into this oppressive threat simply because they are trying to escape poverty or insecurity, and they just want to improve their life and support their families. ILO stated that at any given time in 2016, an estimated 40.3 million people are in modern slavery, including 24.9 million are in forced labor. It means that there are 5.4 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the world. Human trafficking, on the other side, is the process of entrapping people through the use of violence, deception, or coercion, and exploiting them for financial or personal gain. Traffickers usually use force, fraud, or coercion to lure their victim and force them into labor or commercial sexual exploitation. According to the United Nations Office, the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, there are 51% of identified victims of trafficking, of sex trafficking are women, and 28% are children, and 25% are men. 72% of people being exploited in the sex industry are women, and 63% of identified traffickers were men, and 37% of it are women, and 43% of victims are trafficked domestically within the national borders. So the fourth target group is children who are involved in child labor and also child soldier. Child labor refers to the work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful to children, and also interferes with their schooling. by depriving them from the opportunity to attend school, obliging them to leave school prematurely, or requiring them to attempt to combine school attendance with excessively long and heavy work. The number of children in child labor has risen to 160 million worldwide, an increase of 8.4 million children in the last 4 years, and 9 million additional children at risk due to the impact of COVID-19. The progress to end child labor has stalled for the first time in 20 years, reversing the previous downward trend that we saw child labor fall by 94 million between 2000 and 2016. Although there is no national child labor survey in Malaysia, various studies and empirical evidence indicate that child labor is happening in certain pockets of both rural and urban area before the COVID-19 pandemic. Datuk Muhammad Khair Razman bin Muhammad Anwar, Ministry of Human Resources Deputy Secretary General for Policy and International Division, shared that the government is currently developing the first national action plan on child labor in Malaysia. According to him, the national plan will comprise of programs to intensify awareness among the public regarding child labor, to protect young workers and enhance national capacity to eradicate child labor, including strengthening enforcement and establishing referral mechanism, improving social protection. Child soldiers are any children under the age of 18 who are recruited by a state or non-state armed group and used as fighters, cook, suicide bombers, human shield messenger, spies, or for sexual purposes. Many of them are abducted or recruited by force, while others join out of desperation, believing that armed groups could offer them their best chance of survival. Although there are tens of thousands of boys and girls who have been recruited as a child soldier, statistics are difficult to come by. The exact number is unknown, as most data dates back to nearly 2 decades ago. However, we do know that in 2020, the UN Secretary General reported that there are 7,747 children, some as young as 6 years old, had been recruited as child soldiers in the previous year. In the same report, the UN verified that the children were recruited and used in 14 armed conflicts that involved the recruitment and use of child soldiers. While the majority of perpetrators were non-state armed groups, 10 states were verified by the UN to still use child soldiers. The next target group is local entrepreneurs. As mentioned earlier, this SDG has been pretty much stopped due to COVID. In addition to its impact on public health, coronavirus disease 2019 also caused a major economic shock. Therefore, it is important to aid local entrepreneurs to serve the 8.9 target as mentioned earlier. The next target group is marginalized group. Marginalized community are those excluded from mainstream social, economic, educational, and or cultural life. Examples of marginalized population include, but they are not limited to, groups excluded due to race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, physical ability, language, and or immigration status. Even though in Malaysian context, even though they are not really excluded from the educational system, Orang Asli is pretty much excluded from pretty much every other aspect. Orang Asli has some of the highest rate of poverty, and they actually make up less than 1% of population. In 2018, I had the chance to interview few Orang Asli students in SMK Bandar Chiku Gomusa. Those students revealed that they only receive 60 ringgit per month as pocket money from JAKOA, which is Jabatan Kemajuan Orang Asli Kelantan. This means that they can spend only two ringgit during the recess, and they only have to depend on their hostel food after that. They have no other money as resources because their parents can't even afford to send them money. And also, they cannot speak Kelantanese dialect because they have their own language in their hometown. And also, they face difficulties even understanding their lesson because their teachers speak in Kelantanese dialect.
Thank you, Dr. Farhana, for that insightful information. I would like to add a little bit more about the target group. And the next target group is all migrant workers, especially women migrant workers. Research say Malaysia has done little to protect low-wage migrant workers from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, which could hurt an economy that's struggling to recover. Low-wage and low-skilled migrant workers around the world have been among the most vulnerable as businesses cut wages and jobs to cope with the pandemic economic shock. Their predicament often is exacerbated by a lack of assistance from their host countries as governments prioritize to help their own citizens. Malaysia is home to 2 million documented migrant workers, comprising around 15% of the total workforce. There are an additional 2 million to 4 million undocumented workers, according to the estimates by the International Organization for Migration and internal governmental entity. In addition to the little government assistance, those workers now face dimming employment prospects in Malaysia as the government urges businesses to hire locals in place of migrant workers. In Malaysia context too, when it comes to B40 target group, in Malaysia, B40 is the category that needed help the most from SDG. More Malaysians may find themselves usually being among the poor in the reality amid the COVID-19 pandemic. An article by The Star stated that more than 2.7 million households fall under the B40 category. These are the most affected communities in the current COVID-19 and the Movement Control Order initiative. We can foresee citizens from this group finding it difficult to even put food on the table for their families if the government does not come with some special measure to help them. Therefore, evidently, the B40 category needed decent work to survive the pandemic.
Okay, so our next guest is Tuan Iqmal Daniel, our economy expert, sharing his view live from Muar, Johor.
Okay, thank you to our news anchor. My name is Muhammad Iqmal Daniel, and today I'm an economic expert for more than 15 years of experience. And today we are going to talk specifically about SDG 8, decent work and economic growth activities, right? So there are three key concepts to it, which are what policies are needed to achieve SDG 8, what has UNICEF asked to achieve SDG 8, and also lastly, how COVID-19 has affected decent work and economic growth, right? So let's dive into the first one, which are what policies are needed in order to achieve SDG 8. The first one is to implement international labor standards, including freedom of association, collective bargaining, and social dialogue as a means of implementation of the 2030 agenda. Promoting the DWA, Decent Work Agenda, remains the main objective of the trade union input into the 2030 agenda. Based on rights and democratic ownership, the DWA is the foundation for sustainable development as opposed to palliative interventions. Human and labor rights, freedom of association, and collective bargaining and social dialogue are not only essential ingredients for sustainable economic growth, but are the pillars of democracy building. Building and fortifying a democratic process is in turn the cornerstone of just development. Evidence shows that social dialogue can foster socio-economic progress and be a governance instrument for sustainable development, representing a key means of implementation of the SDGs, bringing together workers and employers' representatives by making decisions that impact on social, economic, and environmental conditions, reinforces institutional stability. However, this requires an enabling environment underpinned by respect for labor rights and the full recognition of the role of trade unions. Next, it would be implement comprehensive employment policy frameworks, including support to labour market institutions. Now, the weakening of labour market institutions is one key cause of increasing inequality. The structural adjustment paradigm that has governed development since the 1980s has had the undesirable effect of reducing the ability of labour market institutions to moderate market inequality. To implement and achieve SDGA on sustainable growth and decent work, comprehensive national employment policy frameworks built upon the principle of policy coherence for development are needed. Governments need to design and implement pro-employment macroeconomic strategies supported by progressive trade, industrial, tax and infrastructure policies, including investment in education and skills development, youth employment, equality, and the care economy. Such policy frameworks should be developed through tripartite consultations, including governments and social partners. The pillars to ensure strong and functioning labour market, policies and institutions. And last but not least, apply minimum living wage with the full involvement of social partners. Now, working poverty remains a major challenge across the globe. Considering that the working poor account for more than 700 million people, meeting SDGs by 2030 will be impossible if this issue is left unaddressed. The decline in the wage share in many countries has contributed to deficiency in aggregate demand, which has been detrimental for growth and employment at the national level as well for the global economy. Implementing and enforcing a statutory minimum wage, guaranteeing an income that allows people to live with dignity and is essential to reducing poverty. Opponents of minimum living wage often argue that vulnerable workers will not benefit because their jobs will be abolished when labour cost increases. However, the ILO has pointed out that employment effects of minimum wages increase are not actually straightforward. Frequent findings indicate that employment effects are close to zero and are too small to be observable in statistics. Frequent findings indicate that in 2016 Employment Outlook, the OECD further highlights the increased skill use, higher productivity, and lower in-work poverty effects that result from higher minimum wages. Okay, so minimum wages should take into account the cost of living, should be evidence-based and regularly reviewed and adjusted, meaning you have to take into account inflation perhaps. Collective bargaining rights must be ensured in order to achieve fair wages above the minimum wage level. Right, moving on. So we are going to talk about what has UNICEF asked in order to achieve SDGA. So there are 9 key things that UNICEF has asked, which are, for the first one would be to support enforcement of legal standards as fundamental to reduce child labour and child recruitment. Second one is to promote and integrate approach to reducing child labour, followed by engage and advocate with business and industry platforms. Number 4, strengthen the reach, calibre and funding of the social service workforce. Number 5, treat children associated with armed forces and armed groups primarily as survivors of child rights violations. Number 6, eliminate child detention for children associated with armed conflicts. Number 7, prioritize unifications. Number 8, endorse the Safe School Declaration and implement the guidelines on protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflicts. And last but not least, UNICEF has asked to prevent violations against children affected by conflict, beginning with preventions of recruitment, conflict, and other grave violations against children. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to talk about our last topic for today, which is how COVID-19 affects decent work and economic growth. Right, okay, so sustained and inclusive economic growth can drive progress, create decent jobs for all, and improve living standards. However, COVID-19 has disrupted billions of lives and endangered the global economy. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, expects a global recession as bad as or even worse than in 2009. As job losses escalate, the International Labour Organization, or ILO, estimates that nearly half of the global workforce is at risk of losing their livelihoods. Roughly 400 million jobs losses is recorded in the second quarter of 2020 alone, with tourism being the one that faces unprecedented challenges the most. Even before the outbreak of COVID-19, 1 in 5 countries, home to billions of people living in poverty, were likely to see per capita income stagnate or decline in 2020. Now, the economic and financial shocks associated with COVID-19, such as disruptions of industrial production, falling commodity prices, financial market volatility, and rising insecurity are derailing the already tepid economic growth and compounding heightened rates from other factors. So today that is all from me. Thank you.
We would like to share more insights on our very own topic. So we would like to invite our very own reporter of UITM News, live from Dungun, Terengganu.
Thank you to our news anchor. I'm Muhammad Alifi Juan reporting from the new Parliament building in Kuala Terengganu. According to Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University, Netherlands, there are over 3 million fatal and non-fatal work-related accidents that happen across the European Union. Meanwhile, here, the New Straits Times reported that back then, Malaysia's fatal accident rate was, number one, 10 times worse than the United Kingdom. And number two, that rate has decreased by 20% since the turn of the century. However, that doesn't mean that we should stop taking the initiative to decrease the percentage anymore. For example, we should remind ourselves that a section of a highway under construction has collapsed near Sungai Buloh. 1 injured and 1 died just last week. So, work safety is just one of the many aspects that SDG 8 is trying to cover. Sure, we know now that the main objective of SDG 8 is to have sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. But do we know the short and long-term positive implications of SDG 8 and even the negative implications if SDG 8 doesn't work, especially in this pandemic? Stay tuned for more in this special news report. First, let's talk about long-term implications. First off, economic growth, technology, and diversification. So in economics, it is widely accepted that technology is the key driver of economic growth of countries, regions, and cities. Technological progress allows for the more efficient production of more and better goods and services, which is what prosperity depends on. It also causes increased communication, easy and fast access to the new markets, increase in the marketing channels, and company mergers. So technological development made a positive impact to the economy. Meanwhile, diversification helps to manage volatility and provide a more stable path for equitable growth and development. So successful diversification is all the more important now in the wake of slowing global growth in this pandemic and the imperative in many developing countries to increase the number and quality of jobs. Next up, global resource efficiency. Resource efficiency means using the Earth's limited resources in a sustainable manner while minimizing impacts on the environment. It allows us to create more with less and to deliver greater value with less input. For example, right now we are using fossil fuel to generate power for our own vehicles. But fossil fuel is not a renewable energy, or should I say, not an efficient resource to be used. So many countries are trying to and even have already developed electric cars that are not only cheaper to use, but also relatively safe to be used for the environment. Maybe in the future we will have those cars in Malaysia. Next up in the long-term implication is inclusive employment. So inclusive employment refers to individuals with disabilities working alongside their peers without disabilities in the competitive labor market, with access to the same benefits and career opportunities. So in order to have a diverse workplace, inclusive practices for hiring, training, engaging, and retaining employees is key. Now, number 4, labor rights, health, and safety at work. Workers' rights encompass a large array of human rights, from the right to decent work and freedom of association to equal opportunity and protection against discrimination. Specific rights related to the workplace include health and safety in the workplace and the right to privacy at work, amongst many others. Given the relationship between workers, employers, and the state, workers' rights are where business and human rights most often intersect. Workers' rights at the international level are laid out in a number of human rights conventions and treaties, including the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Articles 23 and 24, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, 1996, which provide for, number one, the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts. Number two, the right to the enjoyment of just and favorable conditions of work, in particular remuneration, which provides all workers as a minimum with fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value and a decent living for themselves and their families. Number three, safe and healthy working conditions. Number four, equal opportunity for everyone to be promoted in his employment to an appropriate higher level, subject to no considerations other than those of seniority and competence. And finally, number five, rest, leisure, and reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay, as well as remuneration for public holidays. Number five, in the long-term implication, is eradication of forced labor, child soldiers, and child labor. Tens of thousands of girls and boys find themselves fighting adult wars in at least 17 countries in different regions around the world. Regardless of how children are recruited and of their roles, child soldiers are victims whose participation in conflict bears serious implications for their physical and emotional well-being. They are commonly subjected to abuse, and most of them witness death, killing, and sexual violence. Next up on the list is financial access or financial inclusion. So, having access to financial services is important to both individuals and companies, as it provides a means of storing money, managing payments and cash flows, accumulating savings, accessing credit, and making investments. So this kind of access is also key to acquiring assets and building financial security. Last one in the long-term implication of SDG 8 is, of course, Aid for Trade. So Aid for Trade is an initiative by the World Trade Organization, WTO, as well as a policy concept in international economic and trade development concerned with helping developing countries, and particularly the least developed countries, to build trade capacity and infrastructure. So Aid for Trade also includes measures to help countries develop trade strategies, plans or projects and implementation, such as building roads, ports and telecommunications that link domestic and global markets, or investing in industries and sectors to help diversify exports. Now let's go through the short-term implications of SDG 8. Number one is, of course, safety at work, which means decent working conditions for all employees. Number two, more educated and trained labor force, which also focuses on the vulnerable and economically disadvantaged groups. Number three, creations of decent formal sector in labor-intensive sectors, especially in least developed countries. And number four, pushes economic growth and productivity through investment in research and development, which will upgrade skills and supporting growing businesses in a way that is compatible and sustainable development. Basically, these short-term implications of SDG 8 is just the condensed version of the long-term ones. Now, let's go through the negative implications if SDG 8 doesn't work. Since SDG 8 is heavily linked to the first three SDGs, no poverty, zero hunger, and good health and well-being, the first negative implications is, of course, global economic growth slowing down. For example, from 2% GDP per capita growth in 2010 until 2018 to only 1.5% GDP per capita growth in 2019. And that was before the COVID. Now the world faces the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, with GDP per capita was expected to decline by 4.2% in 2020 alone. Second one is, of course, loss of work. With COVID-19, 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy risk losing their livelihoods, and it might have caused around 400 million job losses back in the second quarter of 2020. Thus, with the global economy slowing down and job losses, of course, this will lead to poverty, hunger, and of course, loss of good health and well-being, which will also increases the rate of forced labor, slavery, and human trafficking. That is all from me. Back to the studio.
So now let's move on to a different perspective. We have a retired teacher, Mr. Saiful Nazmi from Ipoh Perak, as our next guest.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. I am Mr. Saiful. Before this, I was an English teacher in St. Michael Institution in Ipoh, but now I've retired. Well, if we want to promote the SDG 8, which is about having decent work and economic growth, I believe every institution should play their roles instead of living on other people's shoulders. And first and foremost, if we want to promote SDG 8 into school activities, surely we cannot abandon teachers as they are the agents to have promote SDG 8, right? So for some teachers, they might think that promoting SDG 8 is a waste of time, as they need to finish the syllabus and focus on their examination. Trust me, I've been there before. However, they don't realize that we as teachers, we need to help our students to prepare them for the real world, the working world. Which is why teachers should directly or indirectly promote SDG 8 into the syllabus. Well, from the workshops that I have attended before, teachers can actually integrate any form of activities that can help to spark students' interest in business. Let's say you are an English teacher. You can definitely do a role play about a businessman dealing with his or her customers. By doing so, it can help to improve students' proficiency and at the same time, help to promote SDG 8 indirectly as well. Next, parents play a crucial role in promoting SDG 8. You might wonder why I mentioned that parents should play their roles in promoting SDG 8, right? Even though they are not working with the school institution. That's where you're wrong. I would say that parents are the indirect agent in helping schools' curriculum to be effective. Generally, students spend around 6 to 7 hours in school. So, during the remaining hours, they would spend their time with their parents, which is why parents play a crucial role in emphasizing on what their children have learned in school. For instance, parents can, help to promote SDG 8 by encouraging their children to pursue their passion instead of belittling their passion just because they are still underage or immature. Well, if the parents encourage and help to polish their children's skills, speaking from my experience, I can guarantee that their children will go far in life. And last but not least, being on top of the hierarchy, the Ministry of Education plays a crucial role in promoting SDG 8. Since they are the ones who develop the curriculum, they should instill the essence of business in the school curriculum. I think by doing that, they can actually help to expose students to the idea of creating their own business after they leave secondary school. Or perhaps the MOE could actually enhance any topic that encourage students' creativity and innovation. Yeah, I think that would be a great initiative, right? To prepare our students because before they pursue their tertiary education. Well, from the agents that I have mentioned just now, I would say that the Ministry of Education plays an important role because if they don't implement the essence of SDG 8 in the curriculum, we cannot actually help to encourage students to dwell into business. Hence, at the same time, helping them to escape their current socio-economic status.
So we would like to invite our very special guest, Tan Sri Zeti Aziz, to share her insights on our very own topic.
Thank you, UiTM News, for interviewing me. Hi everyone, I'm Zeti Aziz, former governor for Bank Negara Malaysia. Well, before I start, I must say that the topic is very interesting and extremely important for our future leaders to gather gist on the working world and also to spark their interest in business. If you truly want to promote the concept of having decent work and economic growth in school, I believe the school institution should definitely create students' entrepreneurship club or organization. By giving students the autonomy to do business within the school area, it can definitely help to spark their interest in business from an early age. Some might think that this kind of club is a waste of time, but well, I think that's probably because they could have focused on the academy instead. However, they fail to realize that by doing so, we will send them a clear message that doing business can actually help them to generate their own money. Secondly, I would strongly suggest the Ministry of Education to actually improve the subjects that encourage students' innovation and creativity. Well, based on my visits to some secondary schools before the pandemic, I noticed that some students, and I'm sorry for saying this, but some teachers also view the Rekabento and technology subject as something that is less important than other core subjects. What people out there need to realize is that this kind of subject will subconsciously or indirectly prepare our future leaders for for the outside world. Let's say students who came from a poor family and unfortunately do not get colorful results for his or her SPM, then that student can definitely generate their income by, selling products that they have learned in that subject. Do you guys still remember about the what we call it, the keju that we had to do in high school? Well, this is what I made. This is the keju that I made during high school. Well, this is supposed to be a wooden pencil box, even though it looks like coffin. And this is another keju that I made, which is supposed to store your pencil and also to hang your case. Interesting, right? So, as you can see, students can actually get the idea of doing their own business from this type of subjects. Next, in order to promote the SDG 8 to students, I believe teachers and the MOE should provide basic financial knowledge to students. I know that there are some students who take accountancy subject as one of their elective subjects right in school. Well, for them, they will definitely have a gist on what financial is all about. However, for those who are in art stream, they do not possess that kind of privilege as compared to other students. Hence, I would strongly suggest to include a non-examination subject for every, I would say, Form 4 students, so that they will be exposed to basic financial knowledge to do, such as, well, perhaps they can learn on how to do their taxes, how to generate their own income, or perhaps in the syllabus, the MOE can actually include how to do an online business. Yes, I think that would actually be a great idea for novice businessmen who would like to venture into the business world, right? Moreover, if the school institution really wants to promote the SDG 8 into the school activities, I would actually suggest the school to partner with external organizations in order to collaborate with them. I believe this would be an amazing opportunity for students to get the experience from the successful individuals who have built their own career in various fields. For instance, you can deal with any corporation to ask them whether the students can go to their headquarters for a field trip. During the field trips, the students will be able to ask any questions, or I think it'll be even better if the HQ provides a seminar to the students. As far as I'm concerned, there are many schools that organize field trip to our Bank Negara. During the field trip, I will give a short speech if I'm not busy lah on that day. But yeah, I will try my best to spend time with the students from, that came from all across the country. Then during the field trip, not only the students can get the first-hand experience from successful individuals, but they can also be inspired by them as they can visualize their own future by witnessing the success of these individuals in the headquarters that they visited. Other than that, the teachers should also relate theoretical content to real business challenges. Well, I am aware that students only learn the theoretical content in the economy syllabus. However, other subjects such as English or even Bahasa Melayu, can also inculcate this topic to indirectly promote SDG 8. For instance, if the lesson is about money, and then the teacher can actually teach them about the importance of money management, or the teacher can even conduct a debate, I think, about who should we blame for our country's inflation. I think that would be a great topic that they can discuss right during the debate. However, I think that that kind of topic may not be suitable for the lower secondary, because I think they might not have the exact schemata to, talk about this kind of heavy topic. But yeah, nevertheless, the teacher should relate the theoretical content that they have taught their students to the real business challenges to have engaged students to the lesson. And last but not least, the school institution can also host an entrepreneurship contest in school. There are so many benefits of conducting this kind of contest. Firstly, it can help to prepare students for the uncertain future. Let's take the impact of the COVID-19 on our well-being. Many graduates cannot even find jobs because most companies are having money crisis, right, during the pandemic. So if we prepare our students to do an online business or anything, then they can actually resort to do an online business while waiting to get a secure job. Secondly, after learning all the theoretical perspective in the classroom, this kind of contest, I think it will be a great platform for students to practice what they have learned. It's sort of like giving the hands-on learning opportunities to our students. So yeah, based on my point of view, that is how we can help to promote SDG 8 into our school curriculum and activities. By the way, if there are any schools that would like to collaborate with the Bank Negara, please reach us. Please reach us out, because we know that everyone is struggling right now, right? But that does not mean that our children's education should be put a blind eye out. Sorry, I don't think that our students' education should be put a blind eye on. So yeah, that's from me. Thank you so much for interviewing me.
So that's all for our news today. I'm Nur Farhana.
And I'm Noor Shazwani. Good night.